Hello everybody, this is International Master Jesse Cry, and today we're going to talk primarily about pawn endgames and the concepts of Zugzwang, opposition, and triangulation. Now before we go into pawn endgames, I wanted to show this position, which I consider a little bit comical, in order to illustrate the concept of Zugzwang. Now this is a standard position where rook and king mate the king. And generally this is known to be a win for white. But let's imagine a kind of chess in which black here could pass if he wanted to. Okay? So, for example, in the normal game of chess, it's going to be made in two, because if we go king f8, then it'll be immediately rook h1, king c1, rook h1, and if we go king a1, then white will just play king b3, the black king will have to come back to b1, and then rook h1 mates. But now in this new version of chess, where black gets to wait out a move, then it's actually impossible for white to force checkmate. So for example, in this position, what black would do is he would just pass. He would pass, and then let's say white plays king b3, then we have king c1, and it's impossible. King c3, king b1, and there's no way to force a mating pattern for the white pieces. Okay. Now, Zugzwang is from the German word Zug, which means move, and Zwang, which means force. So literally, move, force. You're forced to move. So in this situation, you can feel it's like an oppression for black. He has to move. And in so many endgames, if black were allowed to just pass, chess would be a lot less of an interesting game. Even here, the rook wouldn't be able to mate the king. And there's a lot of other situations that wouldn't be winning. And we're going to see that in the pawn endgames. And now the reason I'm doing something that has nothing to do with pawn endgames, besides a kind of a comical situation, is that Zugzwang is everywhere. It's everywhere, especially in endgame play, and it's a very key concept. And of the concepts we're talking about today, it's the most critical. Now, before I go on to the pawn endgames, try this at your club or at the park. Maybe ask someone, you can bet them that they can't mate you if you get to pass. That's a good exercise. Okay, let's move on to the next position. Okay, so let's use this position as our first example. Maybe you could use it to test yourself as well. As first, you can stop the VCR recording. It's white to play and win. Okay, and this is going to be the first case where we use opposition. You see, if we play king e5, what happens is black puts us in opposition. Now let's talk about that for a second. All opposition means is then we get this pattern. This is now white's in opposition because the king is one square removed, and now white's the one who has to move aside. White is essentially in Zugzwang. And so what this means is that this word opposition is a form of Zugzwang. Okay? Let's go back just a second. So when it's white to move here, what he can do is he can put black into Zugzwang, or opposition, with king d5. And let's see how this works out. Clearly white wants to win the pawn on g6. So let's say black goes over. Now again, it's white to move, and white puts black into Zugzwang. The black king will have to cede in either direction. Now, if he cedes anywhere besides f7, white will just walk in with the king to f6 and win the pawn. So let's try king f7, king d6. And now there's a kind of horror here for black, because white is going to be able to separate him from his pawn by use of Zugzwang. Let's take a look at how it would work. King g7, king e7, king h7, king f7. And black has to give the pawn. So let's take a look. King here, king here. Now, black, on his part, could say, well, wait a second, maybe I'll put you in Zugzwang now. Okay? And this is an important key position, and it's winning for white, nevertheless. So let's look at how it happened. King h6. Now, if, say, black plays king f8 or king f7, we'll just play king h7, and then that'll guarantee the march of the pawn to the end of the board. So the only attempt is really king h8. Now watch what we do here. Essentially what's going to happen on the next move is that I'm going to use the fact that I have a pawn move to give black the move. Okay? So I play g6, and now you have to move. You're in Zugzwang. Now if you could pass, this would actually be a draw. Okay? But since you can't, you have to play king g8, g7, king has to come up, and then I have king h7 winning. Okay, so this might seem a little bit complicated, but I'm going to show another position which is a sister position to the one we just looked at, which will hopefully clarify and reinforce some of the ideas we've just looked at. So let's look at this position, which looks very similar to the last one we just looked at, and we're going to find actually an interesting difference. In this position, it's white to move, but he can't win. Okay, and this will demonstrate the fact that the reason why he can't win will demonstrate a lot about opposition and Zugzwang in pawn endgames. Let's take a look at. So clearly we follow our similar pattern from the last game, and we squeeze the black king away from his pawn. And now test yourself here. It's black to move and draw. The correct move is king h7. And the point is, when we take the pawn, black can put white into Zugzwang, or opposition here. Okay? Now you can ask yourself, well, how come this is different? I mean, we just have the white pawn one move back. And let's try to illustrate that. So let's say king f5, king f7, g5. Now, something interesting happens here. g5 is the only move that white can play now to make progress. So g5, king g7. Now clearly if white backs off, the black king will come to the blockading position on g6. So again, the only move for white to try, and this is analogous to the example we had before, is g6. But see, now something interesting just happened, because in contrast to the other position that we looked at, now black can actually back up a space, king g8, which he can't do in the other example because there's not enough ranks on the chessboard. And now with king g8, something curious has happened, and white cannot come to g6 because his own pawn is there. And so what king g8 is setting up is the fact that when white plays king f6, black can play king f8, and we have a Zugzwang, or opposition. And this is a known draw, because now if white plays g7, we'll play king g8, and king g6 is stalemate. And if he doesn't play king g6, then we win the pawn on g7. Okay, so these two positions are critical to kind of a basic understanding of opposition in the endgame. And if you'd like to review this king and pawn versus king, which I really recommend, we have another lecture on the site by Bill Pascal, just simply entitled King and Pawn versus King, where we have a lot of these themes reviewed. Okay, let's move on to another position. Okay, so this is a position which illustrates, I think, a lot of key themes. It's a little bit more difficult, and it's going to illustrate opposition, something we could call long opposition, and also triangulation. All of these concepts can be illustrated in this example. Try to find how to win for black. It's black to play and win. It's not necessarily simple, so you'd have to go into some variations. And while you're thinking about it, one thing I want to say about king and pawn endgames is, more than any other type of position in chess, king and pawn endgames rely on a player's mathematical ability more than any other type of position. In king and pawn endgames, you have to be able to calculate, and concepts, strategical ideas that we find in other positions aren't as important. And that's why in a lot of ways all these words, opposition, triangulation, they're just little mathematical tricks that you can come to know, but really they're not so deep that you can't find them for yourself. Kind of like the very first example with the rooks. Most people have done the rook and king checkmate without even realizing that they were employing this huge concept of Zugzwang, which is so important to all endgame positions. So the concepts themselves are really just helpful ideas in how to conduct this kind of endgame. Now, let's take a look at this endgame, some of its properties. One thing to just observe when you go into pawn endgames is, where do people want to be and when? Okay, and so what I mean by that is, let's say white plays king f2, then he's going to lose with king f4, because now the white king will have to go away and black can come into g3. Okay, so we know already that f2, f4 with white to move is a really bad situation. Similarly, we can say that on e1, that's going to be losing because black will play king e3, and after king f1, we have f2. And we have this familiar situation where now if king g2, king e2, and we have a winning position for black. So we already have two useful pieces of information, that the squares f2 and f4 and the squares e1 and e3 are what some people call corresponding squares. And that's just a fancy word for saying if black can get white in those situations, then he's in big trouble. Okay? Now let's take a look at the position if it were black to move. So black to move and win, and black plays king f5. Kind of a funny move. And technically we have a long opposition. So instead of the opposition being on f4 and f2, we have it on f5 and e4. Okay, so king f5, it seems like a very deep move, but once we have the knowledge of the corresponding squares f4 and f2 and e3 and e1, it's a little bit easier. Let's see how things might progress. King e1, king e5. And we're doing a nice little triangulation with this movement here. And it's based on the fact, really, when we do triangulations, we're usually trying to lose a move. Okay, and that's what's going to happen here, because again, king f2, white can't play because of king f4. So now king f1 has to be played, and now we just go back to where we were. But there's a key difference, see, because we've lost a move, and now it's white to move. So now white's in Zugzwang. So what we did is we used the triangulation to lose a move, okay, to come back to a situation where it's white to move. And now he's lost. For example, well, we've already done it essentially, right? King e1, king e3, king f1, pawn f2, or king f2, king f4, king f1, king g3, and black will pick up another pawn. Okay, so all these concepts sound really highfalutin, but they're just basic tricks in order to manipulate these king and pawn endgames. Let's look at a final example. So this would be a very good example to test your knowledge, and it's white to play and draw. And it's not very easy, and I would suggest maybe even setting it up on a board before you try to answer it. It's not something you can just guess at. Okay, so let's take a look. Let's just make some moves for white and see what doesn't work before we look at what works. If white plays king f2, then we just put him in Zugzwang, and king g3, we follow him, king g2, we follow king g3, and now we come from behind, and it's a win. For example, king g4, king g2, king takes pawn, king takes f3, and the black pawn can't be stopped. So that's not going to work. Now, I'm sure a lot of you guys probably had the first instinct of playing king f1, which looks like an opposition. But let's look at what happens. King d2, king f2, and black has the move king d3. And the point is that in this particular situation, white can't maintain the opposition by playing king f3. And because of that, he's going to land up in the same variation we just looked at. For example, king g3, king e3, king g2, king e2, and so on. So, let me just make a footnote on this. I found another way to win, which is actually kind of cute, and that's g4. And the point is that after pawn takes, we can play e4, g5, e3, and we're gaining time by checking the white king. Okay, but the other way, and there's a lot of, the king d3 move is in a sense better because it's illustrating the Zugzwang motif. So, what we found is a lot of corresponding squares already. For example, if we've already found that if king f2, king d2 is going to win for black, and we found that king f1, no matter whose move it is going to win for black. King g3 was met by king e3, and we have that whole mess. And so there has to be some kind of way out of this for white. And a nice, very nice move here is king h1. Okay, and this is a very aesthetic example of long opposition. So let's take a look at the various possibilities here for black. Let's just do the obvious, king e2. Now we play opposition with king g2. And see, now it's a totally different ball game for black. King e3, king g3. No way to do it. King e2, we just go back. So what this long opposition does is it sets up a series of really corresponding squares, h1 and d1. So for example, on king d2, we'll play king h2. Again, long opposition. If king e3, king g3. If king e2, king g2. If king e1, king g1. So how about king d3? Well then, king h3. And again, we have the long opposition. And anywhere that black goes, we'll be able to meet him with. Maybe one last attempt that black could try would be the funny move g4, with the idea that if I take, that this might be problematic for white, and white loses. However, on g4, white can just play king g2, and then there's going to be no way to win. Because if pawn takes, king takes, and my king will come and eat the pawn. Also, if king d2, and then king h2, and you try g4, now I can get away with taking the pawn because this pawn won't queen with check, and it'll just be both sides having a queen. Okay, so basically what I've hoped to do with this lecture is to present a series of positions where one can see these concepts of opposition, triangulation, and how they relate to Zugzwang, which is really the bigger theme. And I think with pawn endgames, it really is about calculation more than anything else. And what I recommend is that after having these basic ideas, that you solve a lot of problems like this one, and that will help you get a firmer grasp on what's going on in these king and pawn endgames, because it really is a test of your calculation. And just like math, you need practice in solving basic algorithms. So, this is International Master Jesse Pry, hoping you've enjoyed the lecture. Bye-bye.